So, welcome everybody to today's session. My name is Nina Buchmann and I'm a professor at ETH Zurich for Grassland Sciences. So, I hope you all had a great start into the new year, and today we will continue the seminar series for stakeholders and scientists of Super-G. So for those who don't know Super-G, that's a Horizon 2020 project on permanent grasslands and sustainable resource use and grassland use that is running until 2022, 2023, and has 14 participating countries. And we're particularly interested in the delivery of ecosystem services and developing sustainable permanent grassland systems that are productive, that support biodiversity, and deliver a large number of ecosystem services. As you can see today, we have 4 speakers and an increasing number of persons in the audience. And we will have 2 Q&As, or question and answers sessions, one after James Bullock's talk and one after the other 3 shorter talks. Just some housekeeping rules. Please keep your mics muted unless you ask a question in the discussion rounds later on. You can use the chat function, as some of you have already done, to then either write down a question or write down if you want to ask a question verbally by yourself. I will moderate these discussions, and as you have seen when entering, the session will also be recorded, and the plan is to also answer these questions after the webinar so that nothing gets lost. So with that, I would like to introduce James Bullock, who's working at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is a non-profit research institute. And James' research is very widespread, going from wildlife corridors to grassland restoration, using models, but also experiments and synthesis. On the one hand, to understand what's going on the other hand, to scale up, and clearly also to help decision makers on what to do. And today we will hear a talk with the title Combating Grassland Degradation. James, the floor and the screen is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll just share my talk if I want to. Shall I just I'll say yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Can you see that okay?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, yeah, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon almost, isn't it, for you? Yes, my name is James Bullock, and I'm going to talk about a wide range of work we've been doing, hopefully with a good narrative going through it on the issue of combating grassland degradation. A bit about myself. Nina's already introduced me. I'm at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and I work on quite a range of subjects. Those relevant today are restoration ecology, ecosystem services, but also agri and environmental management. And this is me, actually, I think on May the 20th last year, no, 2020, which is an important date in Britain. It was the day Boris Johnson was having parties. But my partner and I went out for our first trip out of lockdown. And this is to a beautiful grassland in Dorset on the south coast of England, where we live. It's an ancient semi-natural grassland, and the rocks you can see behind me are sarsen stones that were deposited during freeze-thaw events as the last ice age ended. So that's a nice semi-natural grassland. And I'm going to focus to start with on semi-natural and natural grasslands, but move into intensive grasslands later on in the talk. And as I'm sure you know, semi-natural and natural grasslands are a globally important biome. I think to the uninitiated, they can look quite the same, sort of low green habitat, but these photos from natural and semi-natural grasslands across the world show the variety that one can see there. and which are very important in each of these countries, both for biodiversity and for ecosystem services. And one issue we've raised in this the review we've mentioned at the bottom here is that grasslands are often what we call the Cinderella of the world's biomes. They're often, if you look at policy documents such as IPBES or the Conventional Biological Diversity, or even European biodiversity strategy, grasslands are often not mentioned, whereas other biomes such as wetlands and forests are very heavily mentioned. And I think part of the problem is that there's problems in defining grasslands, but also they are often seen as human created and therefore bad in some way, which of course we wouldn't agree with. And maybe because of this neglect, grasslands are undergoing quite a lot of degradation across the world. They cover, estimates vary, but they cover about 40% of the terrestrial world surface, depending how you define them. And about half of them are undergoing degradation in some way or form. Now, degradation has a variety of definitions. The simplest one is an ongoing loss in productivity, usually measured by changing NDVI. But also there are other ways of measuring more easily at local scales, such as loss of biodiversity or soil erosion, a range of things. But this map here we put together for this review suggests about half of the world's grasslands are degrading or degraded in some way or form. And this is through a range of threats. So there's agriculture intensification, the first 3 or 4 you can see here, which is leading to loss of native and natural and semi-natural grasslands, but also conversely leading to the creation of permanent or intensive grasslands. But also we see a range of other threats. Overgrazing is quite a big issue globally, and the converse, in a sense, tree planting or abandonment usually through socioeconomic reasons, and tree planting because of this big push now for net zero. We also see in many places exotic shrubs and trees invading grasslands. We see urbanization and also factors relating to climate change such as fire and drought, a great range of things which play out in different ways across the world. Now, as I said, grasslands are often neglected in policy, and this inspired us to put this paper together a couple of years ago, just to demonstrate the grasslands are very important for ecosystem services. We gave the paper this rather provocative title, More Important for Ecosystem Services Than You Might Think. And in this, we surveyed the services that grasslands provide, and we focused with a literature review and expert opinion on 2 regions, Northern Europe or Northwestern Europe and South Africa. South Africa dominated by natural grasslands, Northwestern Europe by semi-natural. And in this survey, we looked at what these grasslands supply in terms of services, but also what the demand from society is. And you can see there's quite a range of services that grasslands can provide to a great degree. So services related to supply of clean water, but also preventing flooding. Services related to carbon storage and sequestration, and the grasslands can be really important for this, especially in the soil, obviously. Services related to agricultural production, obviously meat, dairy, wool, etc. And more traditional production from grasslands, such as medicinal plants and materials and wild foods, which can be more important in more developing countries. They also supply services for cropland through pollination and pest control, and also a great range of cultural services, which grasslands are really important for: tourism and recreation, hunting, and a lot related with cultural identity, heritage, social cohesion. And last but not least, grasslands, probably more than any other biome, have been really important for the development of scientific theory and understanding in relation to ecology and agroecology. And one thing this survey showed was that we looked at demand for these services in these different countries. And while South Africa, which still has extensive areas of grassland, although some of it's degraded, we felt that the supply of services from these grasslands matched the demand. In northwestern Europe, the supply fell short, mostly because these grasslands are much decimated. We have small fragments left, so they're not really meeting that demand. And we can look at that idea in more detail here in this going back to the study we published last year, where we adapted a methodology for looking at what ecosystem services are required from grasslands from different stakeholders, how degradation affects these services, and what one might do about it. So this really recognized that grasslands are not providing services just to one set of stakeholders. And this is very important when one considers intensive grasslands, that one can set the perceived requirements of farmers and of the food industry above others. But this is to recognize that there are other stakeholders in the landscape and at larger scales, which may need to be considered. I think really important here is the point I made earlier, that degradation may be viewed differently by different stakeholders. So an obvious point that if one intensifies production on the grassland, that may meet some farmers' needs, but it may pose the needs of conservationists, and it's dangerous to set one above the other. One should consider all together. So in this generalized framework, which I'll explain in more detail in relation to specific examples in a minute, we said we need to recognize the stakeholders in any particular region. Here it's just a coarse example, but here local farmers, national decision makers, and conservationists, what their demand for different ecosystem services from grassland is, identify how we measure and understand those services from grassland, and then understand how degradation has affected those services and what options, we call them in this paper restoration options, but wider management options might be a better way of thinking about it, how they would affect certain services and therefore the requirements of different stakeholders. So this we go into more detail here. So we developed one example for European grasslands with a focus on grasslands in the Alps. I should emphasize that this isn't a particular study, but it's based on one of the co-authors on this paper, their work in this region, and putting together various data sources. So I think it's more of a worked example than a specific approach, which we would say this is what you need to do for the Alps. So in this area, the degradation we're calling intensive agriculture. Already note that that's a somewhat value-laden concept, but we can assess those values as we go through the example. And we identify 3 groups of stakeholders: conservationists, local farmers, and national decision makers. And here we assess the demand for different ecosystem services from grassland. So unsurprisingly, conservationists have demand in terms of charismatic species, aesthetic value, cultural identity, those sort of things. Farmers have requirements, yes, in terms of fodder production, but also in relation to soil fertility and cultural identity, which has been picked up through interviews and work with the farmers. And then in this case, national decision makers have quite a different set of demands. The main importance lies in climate regulation and water quality. So a range of different demands, and we can see how this intensification of grasslands has affected the supply of these services. And notice that that in some cases the intensification is so great that even the production services have been undermined because of degradation and loss from the grasslands. And so we examined, in this case, 3 different restoration or management options: conservation, where we restore more traditional management of the grasslands; we carry on with intensive livestock grazing; or we actually abandon the grasslands. And each of those brings different benefits. So this conservation management certainly provides benefits for conservationists, unsurprisingly, but also it does provide some key benefits for the farmers because they have a demand for organically maintained soil fertility, and also cultural identity in this region is really important. But also the fodder production, the livestock, grazing, etc., is another option which provides many benefits for farmers, but not necessarily for other stakeholders. And the abandonment of agricultural management completely could be favorable for some national decision makers because of the prioritization of water quality and climate regulation. And so we're going to set all these different outcomes against each other and use them in further debate and discussion about what the best options might be. But already we are analyzing that different stakeholders have different requirements, and one should not necessarily place one above the other, but try to find compromises or ways of dealing with these different needs. So this is quite a different example taken from East Africa, where invasion of alien woody plants such as prosopis has been a big issue. And this transforms these more natural grasslands, but long managed, into scrub with bare soil. Now this invasion reduces supply of most ecosystem services, apart from the fact that it's scrub becoming trees. We get a good supply of fuelwood and charcoal. The stakeholders here are a different set. We have pastoralists, but also charcoal producers, and this ongoing conflict, if you like, between pastoralists and charcoal burners or producers is a very long one, which is still not resolved. But also a major use of this landscape is by tourists. And each of these stakeholders, again, have different demands. The pastoralists have want quite a range of services from the region, but especially fodder production, and they're worried about soil degradation, etc. The charcoal producers mostly want trees and scrub so they can produce this charcoal, and the tourists are interested in activities which maintain, unsurprisingly, the characteristics that increase tourism potential. So more traditional managed grasslands that provide wildlife for them to see, etc. So as I said, we can see how the degradation affects those services and look at a range of different options. Here was more conservation management, where it's much more extensive grazing and management for conservation purposes. We have more intensive livestock grazing, maybe in fenced areas, and we also can abandon the grasslands. And this shows conflicting demands and conflicting management. The different management options give different outcomes, but do not really resolve the conflict, really. So the livestock production aspect is favored by pastoralists because it produces fodder, which they need. The abandonment is favored by charcoal burners because you get the wood products. And the ecotourism demand favors the conservation actions. So again, there's a basis for starting to consider these trade-offs and any possible synergies. And I think especially here raises the issue of who has power in these regions and who makes the decisions. But at least by doing this sort of thing, we can understand better what the different demands are, and that people have less power are still recognized and their requirements are still recognized. So that's sort of, in those, looking at those, we've set one thing we've seen is that setting of intensive grassland production against more grassland with conservation value, maybe at natural or semi-natural. Certainly in Europe, we know intensive grassland, the creation of intensive grassland has been a major cause of loss of semi-natural grassland. I mentioned earlier Dorset, where I live, and we have the benefit of lots of really good historical data. And so you look at the map of Dorset from the 1930s, and we see how that's changed through to more recent years. And here in more recent years, we see the bright green of intensive grassland and the dark brown of arable, which dominates the landscape. It's very different in the 1930s, where the pale orangey color of semi-natural, so this is neutral grassland, and the pale green of calcareous grass dominated with the brown of arable you can see through there. So in 1930s, we had 155,000 hectares of semi-natural grassland. By 2015, this is down to less than 3,000 hectares. That's a 98% loss. And that conversion from semi-natural to intensive grassland has been a major cause of that loss. So we see over that time period, not just the conversion to arable, but the conversion to intensive grass has been a cause of loss. And interestingly, in recent years, while loss has declined a lot, there is still ongoing loss, and most of that is to intensive grassland, whether that's through direct activities by farmers or ongoing eutrophication. So that sets out a major conflict and trade-off in the area, which is mirrored across much of Europe. And in these grasslands in Dorset, we've been able to look more closely at biodiversity and ecosystem service responses to that intensification. Now here we were able to take those grasslands which we knew were calcareous in the 1930s, and some have been made into really intensive grassland, some have been made semi-natural, and there's quite a lot in a more intermediate stage of semi-improvement or restoration. So we have a gradient from intensive through to semi-natural, which is on the x-axis here. And we've measured a range of aspects of biodiversity and ecosystem services on these. And all these show the benefits of semi-natural grassland compared to intensive. So we have a greater richness of plant species, we have a greater abundance of pollinators. Aesthetic value is increased as measured by people's responses, and things like the percentage carbon held in the vegetation is much higher, although of course the production on the intensive grasslands is higher. So that trade-off is quite clear. So what might we do about managing that trade-off and improving the biodiversity and ecosystem services in intensive grassland? So can we move them slightly back towards semi-natural, maybe without going all the way back? And I'll give a brief overview of some information we put together for this publication a couple of years ago. So maybe the least radical thing to do is to moderately change your management by looking at how one cuts or grazes the grassland, how much fertilizer one puts on, and what pesticides. And I won't go into detail here, but there's quite a few studies across Europe of how these different activities can provide moderate gains in a range of, in this case, biodiversity, arthropod communities, birds. And this is a nice study by Valentin, who's going to be talking later today, quite a few years ago, showed how organic grass farming can enhance biodiversity, maybe without having that inbuilt trade-off with yield, which was quite useful. So there's a lot there, which I'm sure will be more talked about in the later talks. One slightly unusual approach is to put margins in grass fields, much like is much more widely used as the idea of margins in arable fields. And this has been looked at, we've looked at that in some studies quite a few years back now, where you can see these margins are managed quite differently. A range of plant species are sown in. And we showed that if one had these margins and managed them in a very low intensity way, one could increase a range of insect species quite greatly with a lot of without much loss of yield or loss of land to these more conservation activities. More radical again is taking your intensive grassland and trying to add plant species to them. So this isn't restoration of semi-natural grassland, but sowing in agricultural species, which you can see lists of here. And we did this in a study a few years ago where we contrasted. This was degraded degraded intensive grassland, and we reseeded with just grasses. You can see agricultural grasses, but we also contrasted that with reseeding with grasses and legumes, or with grasses, legumes, and forbs. We looked at how the grasses and legumes, or the legumes only, improved a range of outcomes compared with the grasses only. And you can see a range of things such as soil attributes were not affected very much, soil N or soil carbon, but a range of other attributes were much improved by adding in these wildflowers, these agricultural herbaceous species. So we improved pollinators and predator species, improved provision of bird food, and enhanced herbage N, and also yield was moderately increased. Noting here, this was a low fertilizer grassland under environmental schemes. And the most extreme thing one can do is say, I don't want this intensive grassland anymore, I'm going to restore semi-natural grassland. And we and many others have done lots of work over the years on different methods on how to do that, which are shown in photographs here from really quite intensive, if you like, approaches to doing this. And of course, as we already showed, that is a trade-off. You can get some very nice semi-natural grassland back, and you can do that quite rapidly, but you lose the production that is associated with more intensive grassland. So an obvious thing to do here is to think about larger scales, and maybe think about enhancement at the farm scale. And this shows one study in southern England where we did a range of things to enhance grassland. So you have things like your agriculture improved grassland, which is still very productive. You restore grassland in some areas, or you maintain species-rich grassland in others, and you do things like maybe you have your arable land with your grass margins. So you can have a mix of different types of grassland to provide a range of benefits. So rather than just saying I'm going to do it all from one area, I'm going to do different things in different parts of the farm to get a multiplicity of benefits. And this is what we did here in another study we published last year. And I should emphasize here, this was not just grassland enhancement, this was looking at the arable fields as well on a farm scale. And here we contrasted areas, the pink here, where we carried on with conventional management, and the pale green, where we did a range of more standard agri-environmental enhancements. And this included adding forbs or herbs into agricultural grassland, restoring semi-natural grassland in areas, putting in field margins, but also other non-grassland activities like digging ponds, having fallow areas in the grasslands, in the arable fields, etc. And I'm showing this because what I really want to emphasize here is that we also went in and did very detailed measures of the biodiversity and ecosystem service responses. So we looked at how croplands were affected by increase in pollinators. We looked at yield in the grasslands. We looked at water quality by sampling the ponds and the field and the ditches. We looked at water infiltration. We looked at greenhouse gas fluxes. We measured cultural services. And interestingly, we showed quite a range of outcomes. And what we really emphasized in this paper was that, yes, we do get some of the expected benefits of having fallow land, of having wildflower margins, creating ponds, reverting to grasslands, adding forbs to grasslands. But also we got quite a lot of cases where there were no effects of these activities. So let's take the grassland one. So reverting from arable to grasslands, yes, we get benefits of increased soil carbon, soil nitrogen, but we have no effect on methane emissions. If we add forbs to grassland, we got improved yield in terms of digestibility of the forage, percentage calcium and magnesium, and percentage N, but no enhancement here of the dry matter yield or the dry weight, and no effect on the soil processes. So I think this really emphasizes that in different circumstances, one have different outcomes, and we must be wary about assuming the same benefits will arise everywhere depending on what we do. And I'd just like to finish off by thinking about that large scale approaches to what one does, and the fact that different stakeholders gain different benefits from enhancing or enhancement or activities which others might see as degrading. So this steps
James,
away.
3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. That's great. Thank you. This takes going back to Dorset, which you can see here, and as I said, the major thing that's happened in Dorset over the last century is the loss of our semi-natural grasslands. And what we looked at here was what would happen if we took this land, which is mostly farmed, and did different scenarios. One was, we call these Brexit scenarios, where we one was what we called agri-Brexit, where we expand farming. We looked at 2 levels, a very intensive expansion of farming and a less intensive one, to provide more food, which is one of the arguments that we need to feed ourselves better. And the other was to go down a more green Brexit route, where basically we restored a lot of our semi-natural grassland and woodland, etc. And again, there were 2 scenarios where we did a more or less extent of doing that. And that's what these show. The top is the green, where we're creating a lot of habitat, and the bottom is where we're expanding farmland. But a key thing here was we didn't just look at farming yield, we looked at what a range of businesses in Dorset require from the landscape in terms of ecosystem services. And these are some of the businesses which show a very high dependency on ecosystem services. There are quite a lot of others which show lower ones. So as well as agriculture, we see ecological consultants, we see the fishing industry requires a lot. This is more sport fishing, education, tourism is a major activity here, manufacturing as well requires for clean water. And if we take all those needs from these different businesses, all of which have different economic impacts on our local economy, and model how the change in the services provided impacts on those different industries and how that affects the economic outcomes, the so-called gross value added, we find a restoration scenario, these 2 green bars, has a net positive impact on GVA, up to 5% increase in economic activity in the county. Whereas we expand agriculture compared with the baseline, we see a net economic loss because of all these other industries being negatively affected. And I think that really sets that fact that different stakeholders have different needs from the landscape, and take this particular example from grasslands in stark reality. We can't just think about agricultural production by itself. And I'll finish off there. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll take any questions, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks a lot, James, for a very thought-provoking and broad talk. I checked the chat. There comes the first question. Hold on. So Paul would like to know that there are plans to plant thousands of hectares of trees. So the Bond Challenge is one of these many initiatives, and some of which will also be on grassland. So would you have a recommendation on which grasslands should be protected from tree planting, rather the most productive one or the most species-rich one, or something in between, or should we go silvopasture? What would your recommendation be?
Yes, well, that obviously is a very touchy subject, but I think in a sense, all of those are a recommendation. I think the targeting has to be really important. Certainly in Britain, there's a danger that that trees and forests and woodlands are seen as the priority habitat, and there's a lot of talk about the biodiversity benefits. And the biodiversity benefits, especially of semi-natural grassland, are underplayed. So there's a real concern of semi-natural grasslands being targeted for tree planting. So I think that's a priority to avoid that. There is an issue with productive grassland being targeted, but I think we sort of get away from the specifics here and think more broadly that there is an argument that to reach our net zero challenges and our challenges to deal with the climate emergency and ecological emergency, we also need to do other things such as reduce, feed our diets, change other aspects of agriculture, and of course a major aspect of that will be reducing the food from livestock industry, which is a major cause of greenhouse gases. And if that happens, that means production grassland is up for tree planting. A final point I'd say is I think silvopastoral, or if one thinks about more semi-natural grasslands, there is a strong argument, especially if one's thinking about large areas, of having mixed habitats. So if you think about the more arid environments, we have these wonderful savanna type ecosystems. So why not have more scrub and woodland and grassland ecosystems in Europe, which show a mix of these habitats and which are dynamic, maintained by low-level grazing, etc., which I think would be really exciting, because the ecotone between these habitats is really important for biodiversity and also for other ecosystem services such as carbon capture. So I haven't got one solution. I think there are many solutions which we need to think on.
Thank you. Mark has a question.
Yeah, thanks, James. Really enjoyed your talk. The second last study that you presented about the agriculture ecosystems and environment study from 2021, and some of the ecosystem services, there were no results. And I just was interested whether those no results, you thought they might be due to a lack of power, or were they kind of in the opposite direction to what you might have expected? I just wanted a bit more information about that, please.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lack of power, because one looks at the effect sizes, they're very, very similar. Well, there's no effect size, I should say. So it's not that. I think a part of the thing was this was done in an agri-environment setting. So these treatments were running for 3 or 4 years in line with the agri-environment cycle. So so that is a strong issue, which we make it very clear. And is a problem with agri-environment, especially in Britain, but I think other countries, where if one is asking farmers to put in margins or to do various things of putting herbs in grasslands, if one's only signing them up for 5 years or so, then that's too short a time, especially to reach these soil carbon targets. That takes a long time to build up. So that was a strong point we made, that the timescales for agri-environment really need to be extended to really get the benefits. And while it's an obvious point in a sense, it's somewhat lacking in some of the discussions about agri-environment, that there's an assumption we'll get these benefits really rapidly. And the water services, again, were another one where we were seeing very little response. There are many issues with water services about what the local circumstances are, but again, I think these treatments really need to settle down over a decadal timescale rather than a few years.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Bettina has a question on one of the figures from the McCracken and Bullock study, where you showed the gradient from species-rich grassland to the semi-natural more to the intensively grassland. And so how was that gradient defined? Qualitatively, quantitatively? How did you do that?
Yes, that's an interesting point. We talked a lot about this. We initially did it qualitatively, but then based it on, we have something in Britain called the NVC, National Vegetation Classification, which you can fit using ordination methods. So basically it was, we fit it to the standard semi-natural grassland type for this part of the country, and showed the goodness of fit to that. Was a good, the grasslands fell along that quite nicely. We also tested that against our statutory nature conservation body, Natural England, have ways of measuring condition of grasslands, and we also used that, and they showed a very similar approach, very similar gradient. So yes, we were very keen to get an objective gradient there, rather than just say we think this is nicer than that. So that's how we did it. One could use, I'm sure there's wider range of things, maybe some of the corrine biotypes one could use.
Mm-hmm. And there are two questions about the economics of what you suggested. On the one hand, we have different stakeholders where one so the farmers, it's pretty clear how we can derive the income. The others are a little bit more difficult. And on the other hand, if you decrease the income for one, you sometimes increase the income for somebody else, for a different stakeholder. So how do we make that work on a local level where, I mean, there's lots of politics. So how do we do that? Do you have any suggestion, the silver bullet?
Strangely enough, I have no silver bullet. I think what is really important, what I was trying to say with that one and with the Barger et al. Paper, is that I think is really important to take into consideration the needs from a range of stakeholders. And I'm certainly not going to criticize farmers and the agricultural industry here, but similarly, I'm going to say we need to consider what other stakeholders require. And if we make purely economic arguments, in many parts of the world, especially the tourism and the wider societal requirements from these landscapes outweighs any agricultural requirement. Of course, then the question is how we feed ourselves. So I think it's balancing the two. And I think, to be honest, that last example shows very simple scenarios about restore a lot or intensify a lot. I think the point is, let's try to do both. I don't like land sparing and land sharing. I think it's a very simple and simplistic dichotomy, but there are, and we're exploring people are exploring ways of targeting what you do in the landscape. There's going to be spatial components, but also setting that against those impacts. If you do intensify, there are impacts on water quality, etc. If you do de-intensify, there are impacts on food production. And how do you balance all of those at a landscape scale, at a regional scale, at a country scale, at a global scale? And one key thing going back to production is not to get into the situation where in the rich parts of the world we de-intensify and say, look, this is wonderful, but we're asking other countries to intensify food production. This is why I mentioned earlier about changing diets, changing waste. Those sort of things have to come into the whole balance of things rather than just taking the status quo and tweaking it a little bit.
Thank you, James, and thanks to everybody who asked question in the chat and also verbally. So a big thank you to everybody. It also showed that combating degradation and coming up with solutions on what to do and how to protect and or restore is much wider than what we have on the grassland itself. So thanks a lot, James.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Bettina Thon. Bettina is working at the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture in Switzerland since mid of last year. And her research is really on grazing and grazing management, grassland management, and now also diving and linking that much more also to animal nutrition. And Bettina's talk will be linking to one of the questions that she asked to James, namely about a management-based typology for European permanent grasslands. And as I said at the beginning, we will hear now 3 talks, and the Q&A will be together after all 3 talks. So please use the chat and or come then in the, after Valentin Klaus' talk. Bettina, may I give you the screen and all the power on the sharing and putting up your presentation? It's coming. Yes, it's there. You're still muted. You need to unmute yourself. Oh, yep.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. As already introduced, I'm going to talk about a management-based typology for European permanent grassland that we are developing within the Super-G project, in which I'm also working. And I would like to start with the question why such a typology is actually needed, since you already have existing classifications for European permanent grasslands. There is, for example, the European vegetation checklist. This is a syntaxonomic vegetation that has been unified across the whole of Europe. It's a hierarchical system based on botanical composition and indicator species. So it's very well defined. Then there's also the classifications that the EU uses for various policy and other tasks. Above all, the UNIS habitat classification. This is a classification also based on botanical composition mainly, and it's currently being revised to be even more in line with the above mentioned European vegetation checklist. There's also the Habitats Directive Annex 1 habitats, so the protected habitats, and the European Red List of habitats. They all vary a little bit from the UNIS classification, but the criteria are similar, and there are actually also crosswalks between these various classification schemes. So why would we need anything else to complement that? I'd like to illustrate that using example how the UNIS habitat classification represents grasslands, permanent grasslands as defined by the European Union. UNIS classification has also hierarchical, has several levels. And at the first level, we have, well, broad vegetation types. And we find our permanent grassland, obviously, mostly in the grassland group, but there are also a number of heathland and mire and bog and fen habitats that we would consider to be permanent grasslands under the definition used by the EU. And then there is also the category of man-made habitats. But staying with the grasslands, each UNIS category is characterized by a letter and then followed by numbers. And so for the grasslands, we have 6 level 2 units that would correspond mostly to permanent grassland. These are the dry, mesic, and wet grasslands, the alpine and subalpine grasslands, salt steppes, sparsely wooded grasslands. If we go to the next level, these are classified into 51 separate units. And at level 3, it's 143 units. So it's a very detailed classification. And unfortunately, it's pretty hard to know exact areas of different sorts of grasslands because, as has already been mentioned, grassland is often a little bit neglected ecosystem type. But we can say that these make up approximately 300,000 square kilometers in the area of the EU 28 plus. That's, I think, 2018 data. But we have other grasslands as well, and these fall into the category of man-made habitats. They are the dry or moist and the wet agricultural improved grasslands, which make up, well, approximately 500,000 square kilometers. So in the same geographic area. And so this is a substantial part, and it's represented by only 2 of these level 4 classes compared to the 143 that these other grasslands make up. So it's a pretty rough sort of classification for those grasslands that are probably the most important in terms of agricultural production. I just want to show 3 examples. First one would be a extensively grazed, unfertilized grassland, dry calcareous grassland in the Swabian Alp, which has its, well, certainly delivers many important ecosystem services, and particularly in terms of biodiversity, has its unique challenges. So it's one of these grasslands that are mostly threatened by abandonment, by shrub encroachment, and farmers no longer being interested to manage these grasslands. But very similar services and very similar challenges exist for quite a number of other grasslands in Europe as well, that can be found within these various UNIS classes. So many dry or alpine grasslands, sparsely wooded grasslands, heathlands, and so on, face very similar challenges and chances. On the other hand, I'm just showing 2 examples for the dry, moist, agricultural improved grasslands that are quite different. On the right side, we have frequently renewed, resown, very intensively grazed and fertilized grassland in Ireland, which would fall into that category. And in the middle, there's another grassland that would fall into the category. It's cut 3 times, is fertilized moderately. And the challenges and the services between these 2 are actually quite different. So in the right example, we certainly have the problem of nitrogen losses and leaching, and probably also lower carbon because of in the soil of frequent renewal. Whereas in the middle, this looks quite different and also is probably not what would be seen as a semi-natural grassland, but it's also much more species rich than the example at the right side. And another point that should be mentioned is that to use the UNIS classification at the very fine levels that we would need, a lot of botanical knowledge is required, which may not be needed to differentiate between such systems as shown on the left side, those extensively grazed, unfertilized grasslands. If you're looking at, well, how could we improve management? How can we protect them? They are quite similar in that, even though they are botanically quite distinct. So this was the basis for our, well, thought that we need something to supplement, not to replace, but to supplement these very botany-focused classifications. And I'm giving a short overview about the criteria that we're using in the typology. We are looking at permanent grasslands as defined by the EU. And the first distinction would be between those that are human managed and those that are unmanaged. Among those would be the grasslands that are natural grasslands, so they are not on any succession trajectory. They, even without human management, or especially without human management, they remain their composition. And those grasslands that are on a succession trajectory, that would be the abandoned grasslands. So grasslands that will have shrub growth and progress into shrub or forest when they remain unmanaged.
Bettina, 2 more minutes.
Among the managed grasslands, we distinguish between those with no woody plants or very low woody plant cover and high woody plant cover. And then the next step would be to look whether those are actually grasslands that are frequently sown, renewed with a renewal interval less than 50 years, or grasslands that, well, are probably not sown very frequently, so represent a truly permanent grassland. And within that large category, what we are proposing is to try and find a definition for management intensity, to be able to have 3 categories: high intensity, intermediate, and low intensity, that are based on 2 factors. On the one hand, the defoliation intensity, so how often is the grassland cut per year, and or how heavily is it grazed in terms of livestock unit grazing days per year and hectare. So that would be one criterion. And then there's the fertilization intensity, where we would use total nitrogen fertilization, mineral and organic, as an indicator. And the actual algorithm is a little bit too complicated to show here, but basically based on those 2 criteria, there are thresholds where a grassland would fall into either a low, an intermediate, or a high management intensity. And because the same management intensity means something quite different depending on whether you're in a very productive region or, let's say, in the higher altitudes or latitudes, most of these classes are differentiated between productive and marginal regions. And for all those where it's relevant, we also distinguish between predominantly cut grassland and predominantly mown grasslands. And the aim or the outcome of this will be, firstly, to definitely have crosswalks to the existing UNIS habitats, and also to derive mapping rules to try and get some sort of geographical representation of our permanent grassland types at a 100-meter scale and at the level of the NUTS 3 administrative divisions. We're also going to have an online key which asks very simple questions about management, so that stakeholders can, without any in-depth botanical knowledge, find out which type their grassland would fall into, and then also derive information about that is relevant for management for that grassland type in particular. For example, in outcomes from the Super-G project. And finally, there will be portraits of each of these grassland types that will include case studies and basically describe what sort of grassland is represented by each type. And this, in short, is the work that we're doing currently in the Super-G project. And I'd be happy if there are any questions at the end of this block of talks. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina, for that interesting introduction to the typology that has been developed in Super-G under your guidance. So the next talk will be given by Mark Whittingham, who is a professor at Newcastle University. And the research is very much on wildlife and ecosystem multifunctionality, but also on conservation and agroecology. And he will tell us about the impacts on biodiversity when permanent grasslands are intensified across Europe. Mark, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Nina. I am just fiddling with my just trying to get slides. There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Right, so let's try down here.
To the lower right, yeah.
That one?
I don't see the cursor any longer. Yeah, this one. Try that one.
Hey, thank you very much, Nina. So I'm going to be presenting information from Super-G team. So there's a lot of people involved in this project. and I am not claiming to be leading this, but I'm claiming to be talking about it today. If I start with some nice pictures, so this illustrates permanent grasslands in different parts of Europe, which is the focus of our project. And the top left is Switzerland here, where growth conditions are unfavourable, and as in many mountainous regions, and historically, B in Poland, C in Germany, we have grasslands which are relatively nutrient poor and extensively managed. D is the UK, with that little church in the background and very sort of small fields with the cows there. E is the Czech Republic, lots of land lost due to conversion to cropland, and some abandonment in F in Switzerland. So the first part of what I'm presenting is a systematic review. So we were, the team from Super-G was split into 6 groups, and as in systematic reviews, typically we started with a very large number of papers, and we were directed by Jarl, who was our expert in systematic reviews, and he gave us very clear guidance. In the 6 groups were representing biodiversity, which is what I'm talking about today, water quality, water quantity, provisioning services, so grass yield, cultural services, and carbon. So for biodiversity, we were interested in looking at 3 indicators: threatened species, pollinators, and plant species richness. So the first part of the work I'd like to show you is the results of that wider review, which was led by René Schills, and that paper is in press. So you can see, not atypically from that 92,000 in the larger group, there were 22,727 papers that were potentially linked to biodiversity, and the number that could fit into our wider review, which posed a number of questions about management and land use, was whittled down to 138 that could be looked at in detail. So that was done with a combination of looking at the titles, looking at the abstracts, and the teams, and there was some cross-validation there. So these are the results with some nice donuts which were developed by René. And these simply show the number of studies that were related to the direction of the relationship. So if I start on the left here, you can see this is looking at land use. So what happens if we take permanent grassland, which has been in existence for 5 years or more, and compare it to cropland? You can see, not surprisingly, the one study that did fit that criteria found that there was increased plant richness. That's here. And you can see that threatened species, there were 11 studies, and most of them found that permanent grassland was better than cropland. You'll notice here, when you look at permanent grassland compared to forest, threatened species generally did better in the grassland. But the threatened species, there are a lot of threatened species associated with grassland, so the number of species is relatively small. And comparing with permanent grassland and temporary grassland, sample size is very small. If we move over onto this side, this is looking at management, and we're looking at grassland renewal, so resowing of grassland, increased number of species. So if you had greater number of species in the sward that was sown, not surprisingly, you had greater numbers of plant richness and greater numbers of pollinators. Presence of legumes was quite an interesting one, because when we looked across all the 6 services, that was one that came out consistently positive, other than for yield. And here you can see, not surprisingly, the amount of nitrogen input was negatively related to all 3 of these factors: pollinators, threatened species, and plant richness. Now note that we were looking simply at linear effects here, which is important when we come on to the next stage. These put a bit more bones on that, so you can see the effect sizes. But the important thing here to emphasize is that these are linear effects. So as you get more, for example, increased number of species, you get more pollinators, but we don't know anything about the form of that relationship. So that takes us on to the second stage of the analysis, which is still ongoing. And that started halfway through. So the work that was already done in filtering the papers for the systematic review across all the ecosystem services were taken. But then the plan is to look at non-linear effects. So why are we doing this? So this is data from a study which is not related to ours, but just illustrates the point. And you can see the number of ant species on the y-axis, land use intensity on the x-axis. And the point here is that we're interested in trying to pick up non-linear trends. And that's important if we're going to manage grasslands in an optimal way for biodiversity. So if you get the biggest hit from increasing the amount of, for example, nitrogen early on, and you just add a little bit of nitrogen, we know that there's a negative effect, but you get most of that hit early on, as you do here for the ants, or if it was a convex relationship, then you might be able to add quite a lot of that fertilizer before you get a negative impact. So that study is ongoing, and I'm just going to look at some of the numbers. So 1,103 full text articles were assessed. Most of them were about threatened species, 107 about pollinators, 348 about plant diversity. And from those, a relatively small number were suitable to extract effect sizes. And some, in fact, for the threatened species, only of the 17 papers, 12 reported negative effects of management intensification. 3 papers reported intermediate and 2 mixed effects. For the pollinators, of the 7 papers, 6 reported the effects of intensification on more than one group, so that gave 17 outcomes. Trends were mixed. 5 outcomes were negatively related to intensification, 1 was positive, 3 reported intermediate optimum levels, and 2 were mixed, and some showed no relationship. Probably the most accurate data is on plant species richness. So there were more papers that had distinguished plant species richness and related it to either cutting, you can see that in the red here with 19 studies, grazing with 16, or fertilizer with 36, and most of those studies came post 2000.
Mark, 2 more minutes.
Thank you, Nina. So these show the direction of those relationships. So you can see for fertilizer, not surprisingly, there's a decrease in plant species richness here from most of the studies. There are a few that are increasing. Contrasting with grazing, where you get a different relationship, you get some decreasing and some increasing, which is similar to cutting. So what we're moving on to in the final part of this work is to try and look at, probably if I start at the bottom of this slide, causative and associative effects. So for the nitrogen, it's looking at those studies in the literature which have looked at nitrogen but do not have confounding effects of cutting or grazing, which are quite typical of those sorts of studies. You wouldn't normally look at fertilizer without looking at cutting and grazing, but there are some studies that do that, which allow a direct causative effect to be determined. And the other ones are associative, which have cutting or grazing as part of those studies. So this work is in, the studies have been looked at, the effect sizes are being taken from those studies. And that will be probably written up as a separate paper. And after that, we want to use expert elicitation to try and re-look at those studies on threatened species and pollination to put them on a similar scale. So that's the end of this talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mark, for fascinating results of a huge review and even more results coming in from the second part. So our last speaker is Valentin Klaus from ETH Zurich here in Switzerland. Valentin is a vegetation ecologist looking at sustainable agriculture, agro-ecosystems, but also urban ecosystems. And he will tell us about the restoration of plant diversity and ecosystem functions in permanent grasslands by using a very special technique. This is high diversity seeding. Valentin, all yours.
Thank you, Nina. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon from my side. I'm taking you now back to the idea that James Bullock introduced in the very beginning of the talk, that there might be quite a potential to restore grasslands. And I'm presenting an experiment that is, let's say, more scientific. It's not a super applied trial. We can for sure conclude from this, but you will see that some of the properties of the experiment really look into, let's say, mechanisms. But let's just get started. So the idea is to, sorry, that was too quick, to increase plant diversity in established grasslands. All of you might know that there is quite a range of species poor grasslands where we, let's say, still wonder why species are missing. And our questions were first, like, how to best introduce plant species into permanent grasslands. And we have picked this seeding approach so that we buy a regionally produced seed mixture and use that one, which is relatively easy also for stakeholders. And the second question was whether the increase in plant diversity that we may observe or may not observe, whether then translate into changes in ecosystem functions and services. And the experiment looks like this. So it's 73 sites spread across Germany in 3 study regions. And the very long list on the left that you see is that the number of species that we added in the seed mixture. And then we used the topsoil disturbance with farm machinery, and yeah, we crossed these 2 factors and had one control, one disturbance, one seed addition, and the seed addition times disturbance treatment. SWOT disturbance, as you see, was done with farm machinery, so either rotorbation tillage or just with a rotary harrow. Went down to 10 centimeter steps, and we left all the SWOT fragments on site so that they could resprout and revegetate. So we did not remove the topsoil, which is important in terms of the nutrient status. And then the high diversity seeding. So depending on the region, we created 3 seed mixtures from species that were regionally present but locally absent. Not all of these species were actually absent on each plot, but it was just, let's say, we tried to mimic the species pool that was available from the plant breeders or from the seed producers, so to say. And we used these regional seeds. So these were all local ecotypes that were harvested primarily in the region and then were produced in the region and then also used by us in the region. And we have split these seed mixture in terms of quantity and applied half of the seeds in autumn and half of the seeds in spring. That, for example, you might not want to do, and you might also not want to use such high densities. This is why I said it's a scientific experiment, so we want to make sure that we will see a response of the plant community. But still, I think the approach will also work with less seeds, for example, and just applying seeds once. But yeah, as a scientist, you need to make sure that you can measure something in the very end. So you go to the safe side. It's important to mention that the grasslands that have been used in this experiment are spread along a very long gradient. So there's an environmental gradient. You see the water in the front. You also see the 2 disturbed plots on both pictures, and they were all, let's say, old permanent grasslands. So very few of them have been renewed at some point. They were all not specifically degraded, so it was not an attempt to restore grassland that were all in very bad condition, let's say, but it was really to have the entire gradient in environmental and especially in land use variables. So we had quite a long gradient and land use intensity that was covered by the grasslands, starting at the one cut unfertilized site or sparsely grazed site, and it ended at a 3 cut or grazed and mown site, which was considerably fertilized. When looking at the thresholds that Bettina presented, I need to say that 3 cut is for sure not the very top end of permanent grassland management. So we miss those sites which are extremely intensively managed, but I think that also doesn't make a lot of sense to try to enrich the species there. So our results after the second year, we've seen quite a strong increase, most pronounced in the combined treatment of spot disturbance and seed addition. So almost by 50% is the increase on average, which proves that there is quite a strong dispersal limitation. So many of the species that were locally absent are actually becoming part of the plant community at that point, not because they have not been around at all, but they have not been around at that specific place. And it also shows that we need some gaps that these species can establish. So also the spot disturbance was needed to reduce competition of the established vegetation and to enable to have such so-called safe sites. Then over the course of the years, so we've monitored that experiment for 5 years. You see a bit of an up and down in all the curves. So for the disturbance treatment, we see mostly species that are ruderal from the seed bank. So total species number do not really give the more, let's say, ecologically relevant species. So there is a lot of annual species that came up and decreased. And in the very end, we had a very dry year. So there were again some more ruderal species coming up. The seeding trial also successfully established species, but at a very low rate. So that is also significant, and that also continues, but it's far less effective than the combination of seed addition and disturbance. But what we also see is that diversity overshoots. So at this point, we have more species than will permanently stay in the plant community, and you see that it went down a bit. But we also think that it stabilized at the very end. Yeah, as always, in ecology, it's a bit hard to say whether this trend will continue as it is or go further down. We had some extreme years, so might also be that the plant communities themselves were slightly affected by a drought, for example. So the conclusion that I would like to bring now regarding the plant diversity is that the combination of spot disturbance and seeding was the most effective treatment. The increase in plant species richness was strongly site-specific. So what I did not show but wanted to let you know is that with increasing productivity, the establishment success was quite strongly reduced. So the highest establishment was at already species-rich sites on average, so those which were quite unproductive, and at this very intensively managed sites with 3 cuts and more than 100 kilograms of N per hectare per year, there was virtually no increase in plant diversity. And you see that even after 5 years, which is for an experiment already, for such an experiment already quite a duration, we still need to see how the plots will develop. And we're going to do that for sure. Now to the second question, does the increase in plant diversity on each plot actually change ecosystem function and services? We have been looking into 12 different indicators for ecosystem functions, and you see T-bags, so a measure for decomposition. We were looking into nutrient status, of course, also above ground productivity and some soil factors. I'll show you on this slide what we were looking into. So above ground productivity. Yes, thank you, Nina. The CN ratio on the cut, and then the uptake of nutrients and root biomass, for example, soil microbial properties, soil properties, decomposition, and nitrate leaching. And what we finally found was a very, very little change. So the only change that we found is in the isotopic composition of the plant communities, so the so-called delta 15N reduced. And what does that mean? That's a bit complicated. So to put it in a nutshell, a reduction of delta 15N that was also observed along a plant diversity gradient. Sorry, there's a letter missing. That might indicate that we have a more complete uptake of soil N due to increased species complementarity. So that the more species actually took up more and in a more efficient way the soil N. So the conclusions here were that there was actually no effect on yield, but also no decrease. So you could also put that in a positive way and say, well, we now have more species, but actually yield did not change, also not in a negative way. And all the other functions did not really change except these potential effect on N uptake. So the increase in plant diversity might finally be a better argument for grassland restoration or for enhancing plant diversity in established grasslands than changes in ecosystem functioning. So this does not specifically confirm what we have seen from biodiversity ecosystem functioning experiments. What we did not look into, but it might be worth to think of this, is changes in, for example, color richness and aesthetics. So the cluster had pink, which was part of the seed mixers in 2 regions. They were very obviously part of the newly established plant communities. So there might be effects which we did not look into because we found it was too correlated with the plant diversity itself. But nevertheless, on the landscape scale, that might still matter. So the highlights for practice from my side would be that many grasslands are open to higher plant diversity. So grassland restoration works the way we tried that out. That only at highest management intensity, there was no enrichment effect. But yeah, finally, we found marginal effects on ecosystem functioning. Thank you for your attention. And I think we're now moving towards questions.
Thank you, Valentin, for the results of those 2 different experiments. So we heard now in these last 3 talks different perspectives taken in Super G, but also beyond, to identify and to understand changes in ecosystem services by either grassland degradation or conversion of semi-natural grasslands, either to arable or to forest. We now have about 10 to 15 minutes to discuss that a little bit overall, to also in terms of how to improve. So what Valentin now alluded to, except avoiding degradation or avoiding conversion to others. And we have a couple of questions in the chat, 2 by James. One by James to Mark. We also know about what we call the publication bias, so that negative results are not being published and the positive results are. So the question is, do you think that that has affected the 2 reviews that you were reporting on, and how did you deal about that?
Yes, I have just, because I tried to find out our latest version of the manuscript, and I couldn't find the word publication, but I phoned a friend and René got back to me very quickly. And the answer is, our evidence is subject to publication bias, as less effective studies might not have been published. So yeah, there is a problem. Furthermore, our review is biased towards studies published in the English language. The language bias is particularly important for relatively older publications, as many countries like Spain or France had peer-reviewed journals in their native language. Some of the language bias may be offset by the inclusion of many papers published at the European Grassland conferences, which have a less strict peer review protocol. I suspect that text was edited out due to having to reduce word length of the paper, which we had to get a lot of information in there. But yes, it is a problem, James.
Okay. Another question for you from Paul. Could you give some examples of threatened species that were wholly or partly dependent on permanent grasslands, and how important are specific management aspects and practices for those that are particularly threatened?
I would like to bring in Richard Frankson here to answer that question if he's on the call, because he's been looking at that data. The information that I have in my head involves some birds like corn buntings, and some of the information that James has already given. Rick, are you able to talk? Rich, are you able to? Nina, are you, and not you, Dina, are you able to allow Richard to answer that one?
Okay, I'll try. Can you just confirm the name again? Sorry.
Richard Frankson.
Richard Frankson.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, it's here. So I think now we can speak. Richard, can you give us names of certain species?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm sorry, I'm just looking back over the reviewed literature. I can't find any names at the moment, but it's actually, I was talking to Mark about this earlier. It's the threatened species set of papers. It's actually a very small subset of the reviewed literature for some quite obvious reasons that they didn't fit into our protocols very often. It's obviously quite difficult to perform experimental studies on threatened species and things. And I think from the top of my head, there's we had a handful, I think, in the region of 5 or 6 papers that we're looking at, and the majority of those are invertebrates. I think 5 were invertebrate species, which respond very quickly in terms of loss of host plants and like that. There's a species of butterfly, but I'm afraid, yeah, I'd have to look up the individual names and specific.
No problem. Since we said that we will also use the chat and try to answer those questions that we couldn't answer during that webinar, we can follow that up. Thanks a lot, Richard, for coming online as well. Bettina, there was a question to your talk by James, that when you come up with this typology, are you scared that if we now describe the ideal management for any grassland, that we might actually lose the variety of different grasslands? That is taken as a must and not as a typology, but as a recommended management tool?
I don't think that, firstly, it would be feasible. It would be nice to be even able to suggest an ideal management. This is more, the idea is that this typology would be more a communication device to make it more clear to practitioner what kind of grassland we are talking about. Because currently, when you're describing results from different regions, you either have a very specialized botanical description, or else you have this very rough semi-natural versus intensive and little in between. So, and something that is recommended for, well, improving forage quality and an intermediate system might not be a thing that's relevant for, let's say, very extensive grazing at all. So it would help to find results and recommendations from other parts of Europe tackling the same system, but certainly not as a standard one-fits-all solution. For example,
Valentin, one of the questions about if the Delta 15N was due to legumes, you already answered in the chat, so you didn't think so. But there's a second question, if you also found effects on other trophic levels except the plants, so higher trophic levels, so not lower than the plants, which is hardly possible. Do you have some further information on these experiments that you were presenting?
No, unfortunately not. So we tried to motivate some people to look into this because I'm a plant person. I'm not running after the beetles. But unfortunately, the others are a bit skeptical whether the increase would actually work. And so they were a bit reluctant in joining us. I think there could be an effect via increased flower abundance so that we have more resources like pollen or so, but or nectar resources. But as I mean, there is this 7 by 7 meter plot in the landscape setting, and then if there is something flowering, you might observe more pollinators on exactly these flowers. I'm not sure whether this is then a very good mechanistical explanation and helps us to see what happens on a landscape scale. So we were also a bit reluctant to extrapolate our 7 by 7 meter plot too much. So I cannot give you anything on this, sorry.
There are two further questions by Kevin. One is if there were any controls or non-treated grasslands included in this gradient that you were presenting, where the management scheme was altered but were not tilled or resown. And the second question, what about any soil seed bank effects in the seeding or reseeding experiment, the second one that you presented?
Absolutely. So I might answer the seed bank first because that's pretty easy. So we have studied all the seed banks, also which species are there, and we found that they were all pretty poor. Even those which where the grassland had quite a conservation value, the species in the seed bank, that was like the richness was not very large. So I would not expect a real restoration effort from just disturbing the soil and activating the seed bank. I think that doesn't work as soon as the grassland has been used for just a couple of years. Many of these species only have transient seeds, so they do not really build up a permanent seed bank. And the first question, yes, there is also there is also an experiment now going on that changes the management intensity to see whether that has an effect on one plot, also with restoring plant diversity, on the other one with the resident species community, but that just started. So I think 1 year ago, the colleagues established that experiment, and I'm not involved, so I cannot tell you know anything, and they don't have any publication yet, but more to come during the next years on this.
Thank you. And there was a question to Mark about phosphorus that he just answered in the chat, that they were not looking at phosphorus levels specifically. And there's a question to Valentin about the social acceptance of those restoration of single species. So Piotr thinks that the farmers that he knows are not. Did you present your results to farmers in order to understand if they would go that way or if they call you crazy?
I mean, what we did is pretty expensive, right? These regional seeds, they are really, really costly. So what we did was definitively a nature conservation method and can also not be afforded by a farmer just because he likes to increase biodiversity. So this is a very big step, let's say, in changes in plant diversity. But in some countries, there are catalogs of plant species that are required for agricultural payments, like these so-called key species, where you say these 7 species need to be present, and then you get an even higher subsidy for nature conservation value of your grasslands. I know that from Switzerland and Germany, for example, and in Switzerland, there are situations where farmers are actually willing to increase plant diversity also with such regionally produced seed mixtures. So there is an interest, but I think we need to link that to an economic effect. Otherwise, farmers might not take that up on a larger scale. But it's not completely out of scope, so that might work.
Okay, so it might depend also on what the compensation schemes are in the different countries. So we're already 4 minutes past 2 o'clock. So I would like to thank everybody giving talks and also providing answers. I think that was a pretty interesting session. There are tons of more questions, how to deal with Cinderellas that have planted trees in the garden and need to go to net zero agriculture, and all the consumers that either want to eat meat, were like the more supplemented by grass and forage or not. So I guess there are tons of other and additional topics for new webinars coming up. So thanks a lot. Enjoy, at least here, the sunny sky. I'm not sure how it looks at your places. Yeah, everybody turning around. So that also gives us some action. And as I said before, we will try and keep that chat, I think, also open a little bit longer. And we will send those of you who had registered and are here some of the questions. And I just see in the chat that there are some bilateral also. Oh, please send me, I will send something back. So you can also do that here. And thanks a lot for a great discussion. And thanks a lot to Consoli for putting up all the technique. And all of you enjoy that week and do what you can do best. Improve permanent grasslands for lots of ecosystem services. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Nina.